My fiancé wanted to see where her feelings stood for her old crush, so I did what I thought was right. Here's how it all started, and believe me, this isn't something I thought I'd have to deal with at 22, especially after 3 years with someone I expected to marry. My fiancé, who's 21, and I had been together since we were practically kids. We grew up side by side, going through all those firsts and big life moments together. We got engaged just last year, and I honestly thought we were in a solid place. We weren't perfect, who is? But I thought we had the kind of relationship where we were always open with each other. At least I was. Everything kicked off in November. Lately, things had been a little off between us, but I dismissed it as typical stress from work and life. Then I started noticing that she'd been talking to this guy, let's call him Matt. Not his real name, but close enough. I knew a bit about him from her past. He was someone she'd been into way back, long before we got together. I'd even met him once at a friend's gathering, and I didn't think much of it at the time. Sure, I might have felt a little weird about her talking to an old crush, but I'm not the jealous type, so I shrugged it off. Initially, it seemed harmless. She'd show me her phone now and then, telling me something funny he'd said or whatever. It seemed like, okay, he's just an old friend. Then things started shifting, and it felt like I was on the outside looking in. She began going out of her way to bring him up in conversations where he didn't really belong. For example, we'd be talking about our plans for Halloween, and she'd slip in a random comment about how Matt loves Halloween too. It was strange, but I tried to let it go. But the weirdness just kept building. I noticed she was on her phone way more than usual, especially when we were together, which wasn't like her at all. She was the type to leave her phone in the other room, not constantly on it. Now, she was glued to her screen, texting nonstop. When I'd ask who she was talking to, she'd get a little defensive, saying it was just friends. Maybe it was, but something in her tone felt different. One evening, she came up to me excitedly, saying, "Let's watch this new show on Netflix. It's supposed to be really good." We started watching it, and I actually got into it because it was pretty decent. A few days later, I happened to be scrolling through her texts on her phone, which she'd left on the couch while grabbing a snack. And there it was. Matt was the one who had recommended the show to her. It might sound minor, but it hit me hard. Here we were doing something that felt like our thing, and I found out it was actually something she'd started because he suggested it. She hadn't even mentioned that he'd recommended it. She made it seem like it was all her idea. I felt stupid for missing the signs. I scrolled up a bit more, and their messages weren't just casual catch-ups or friendly banter. She was sending him selfies, showing him outfits she planned to wear to work, things I didn't even know she took pictures of, to be honest. And then there was a message that hit me even harder. She had sent him a picture of us carving pumpkins together, captioned, "Look at us being cute." I didn't even know she'd taken that picture, let alone shared it with him. That was supposed to be our moment, but here she was, giving him an inside view of our life together, our memories, as if he was a part of it. It felt like a betrayal, even if nothing major had happened yet. From that point on, it was all I could think about. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself I was overreacting, but then it got worse. She started texting him in the middle of the day, even during work hours. She even began setting her phone to do not disturb when she was with me, saying she didn't want interruptions. But I knew it was because she didn't want his notifications popping up. It felt like she was trying to hide him, but in a way she thought would be subtle enough for me not to notice. And then came the message that completely shattered me. One night, she went to bed early because she had a shift in the morning. I was sitting there alone, trying to relax but feeling uneasy. I did something I never thought I'd do. I went through her phone. And there it was, a message from Matt saying, "It's in your court." Now I stared at that line for what felt like forever, trying to make sense of it. Then it clicked. He was telling her he had feelings for her, and he was waiting for her to decide what to do. My heart sank. And what did she reply? She didn't shut him down. She didn't tell him he was out of line. She said, "Oh wow, that's a lot to take in. I need to figure out what I'm doing here." My stomach turned when I read that. The worst part? She screenshotted that message and sent it to her best friend, captioning it, "What do I even do?" Like she was genuinely considering her options, actually thinking about whether she should go for him. I was holding her phone, feeling like everything we'd built together was crumbling. How did we even get here? I want to make it clear that I understand relationships can be messy, and everyone has those what-if moments with people from their past. But this was different. She was actively talking to him, sharing parts of our life, and keeping him updated on things like he was a backup plan. I kept thinking back to all the small signs I'd brushed off, all the odd comments she'd made, and how I ignored them because I didn't want to be that guy, but maybe I should have been more cautious. The next morning, I couldn't even look at her. I felt angry, hurt, and confused. She was acting totally normal, getting ready for work, asking me if I wanted coffee, but I just couldn't. It was like I was seeing her in a completely new light, and I didn't like what I was seeing. All day, I kept replaying those texts in my head, thinking about every little moment we'd shared recently, and wondering if any of it was real. Had she been thinking of him the whole time? Was I just filling in a space until she made up her mind? I didn't have any answers, but I knew I needed to get to the bottom of it. By the time she came home, I was a wreck. I wasn't sure if I was ready to confront her, but I knew I couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine. I had to say something, to get everything out in the open, even if it meant things would turn ugly. And that's how I ended up sitting there, waiting for her to walk through the door, rehearsing what I'd say, wondering if this would be the end of everything we'd built together. Things really shifted after a while, and honestly, it was nothing like what I'd expected. I'd been with my fiancé for 3 years, and we'd gone through so much together that I thought we knew each other inside and out. But what I found out in the next few hours completely flipped my perspective. She came home from work, acting like it was any normal day, talking about her shift and regular things, while I sat there, not really listening. I was stewing over everything I'd seen on her phone, my head spinning, heart racing, unable to focus on a word she said. I think she sensed something was wrong because she eventually stopped mid-sentence and asked if I was okay. I had to hold myself back because I didn't want to explode right there. Part of me wanted to lay it all out, to show her exactly what I'd discovered, but I tried to stay composed. I didn't want to come across as some guy freaking out over messages. I just nodded and told her we needed to talk, the classic line nobody ever wants to hear. She looked a bit confused, maybe even a little nervous, but she sat down across from me on the couch, fidgeting with her hands, clearly sensing something was up. I took a deep breath and said I'd seen her text with Matt. She went pale. I'll never forget the look on her face when I mentioned his name. It was like she'd seen a ghost. At first, she tried to downplay it, saying they were just friends, and it was nothing serious, just catching up. She talked about how they had history, but it didn't mean anything anymore. And maybe a part of me wanted to believe her, but I had this gut feeling that she wasn't being fully honest. So I pressed further, telling her I'd seen how she'd shared parts of our life with him, selfies, the picture of US carving pumpkins, all those little moments that were supposed to be between us. That's when she started getting defensive. She said she didn't understand why I was so upset, that it was casual, and she hadn't done anything wrong. But the way she was talking, avoiding eye contact and looking down at her hands, I knew there was more she wasn't saying. It felt like she was skirting around the truth, giving half answers, and trying to make me look like I was overreacting. Finally, I asked her about that message from him, the one where he'd said, "It's in your court now." I asked her directly what he meant by that, and her expression changed. She tried brushing it off, saying he was just flirting and she didn't take it seriously. But I knew that wasn't the whole story. I mean, why would she screenshot it and send it to her best friend if it didn't mean anything? She kept dodging, saying she didn't know what to do because she didn't want to lose our relationship, but she also didn't want to cut him off completely. She kept saying, "It's complicated," as if that was supposed to make me feel better. I just sat there thinking, how is this complicated? You either choose the person you're engaged to or you don't. There shouldn't be any middle ground here. Then she hit me with a line that shattered me. She said, "I didn't think you'd understand that was her reason for not telling me about him, for keeping everything hidden." I didn't even know how to respond because, yeah, maybe I wouldn't have been thrilled to know she was reconnecting with an old crush, but I would have listened. I would have tried to understand if she'd been upfront with me from the start. But this wasn't honesty, this was hiding things, sneaking around, and pretending everything was fine. And for what? To protect my feelings? No, it was to protect herself, to keep him in her life without dealing with the fallout. At that point, I wasn't even sure what I was trying to salvage. It felt like everything I thought we had was slipping through my fingers, like she'd already made her choice, and I was just the last one to know. I asked her one more time, "Are you really telling me there's nothing more to this?" She hesitated far too long before finally saying, "No, there's nothing more," but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still hiding something. Her words didn't match her expression, and her body language was all over the place. I've always been pretty good at reading people, and everything about her was screaming that there was more she wasn't saying. But she decided to stick to her story, to keep pretending it was all innocent. So I told her I needed some time to think. I didn't want to make a rash decision out of anger or hurt, and honestly, I felt blindsided. I said I'd stay at my parents' place for a few days to clear my head. She didn't try to stop me, which I found strange. She didn't ask to come along, didn't even try to discuss it further. She just nodded, almost as if she was relieved that I was leaving. That night, I packed a bag and left. As I drove to my parents' house, I kept going over everything in my head, wondering how I'd missed the signs, and if maybe part of the blame was mine for not seeing things sooner. We'd been together for so long, and I thought we were a team, but now I was questioning every memory, every moment from the past few months. Had she been drifting away all this time? And if she had, why didn't she just tell me? I spent that whole night lying awake, replaying every conversation, every glance, every small detail. I started thinking about the subtle changes I'd ignored, the way she'd become more private with her phone, started going out with friends more often, and suddenly developed new interests I didn't even know about. It felt like she'd been building a separate life right in front of me, and I'd been too trusting to notice. Maybe a part of me was clinging to the hope that there was still something worth saving, that we could talk it out, go to counseling, do whatever it took to rebuild trust. But as the hours went by, that hope started to fade, because the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like I was the only one still holding on. The only one holding on to something that maybe didn't even exist anymore. By the next morning, I was worn out physically and mentally. I was supposed to go to work, but I ended up calling in sick because I just couldn't face anything. My mind kept circling back to her, those texts, and that nagging feeling that I hadn't even begun to uncover the whole truth. By the end of the day, I realized I would have to go back and confront her again. This time, I wasn't going to let her dodge. I wouldn't allow her to hide behind any excuses. I needed the truth, the whole truth, because I knew for certain that I couldn't move forward until I knew everything. After spending a few days at my parents' house, I understood I couldn't leave things unresolved. My head was still spinning from everything I'd found out, and my frustration was only growing. I had too many questions that needed answers, and I wasn't going to let her keep sidestepping the truth. When I got back to the apartment, she was there, seemingly waiting for me. She looked nervous, which honestly only fueled my suspicions. She knew I hadn't come back to smooth things over. I sat down, and I could tell from her expression that she realized this wasn't going to be easy. I looked her straight in the eye and told her we needed to talk again, and this time I needed the whole truth. She started with the same lines she'd used before, that nothing serious had happened and that they were just reconnecting as friends. But I wasn't buying it. I told her I wasn't looking for explanations or excuses. I wanted to know exactly what had happened with Matt and why she'd let things go so far, even to the point where he felt comfortable enough to tell her his feelings were in her hands. I could see her squirming, like she was searching for the right words, or perhaps just the words that would make her look less guilty. She kept looking down, avoiding eye contact, which was unlike her. Normally she was straightforward, but now she looked like a kid caught in the act. Finally, she took a deep breath and admitted that maybe she'd let things go too far emotionally. She said she got caught up in the attention and hadn't realized how much it would hurt me. But the way she hesitated told me there was more she wasn't saying. So I pushed further and told her to tell me everything, no half-truths, no dodging. I wanted the full picture. After a long pause, she said something that made my heart sink. She admitted that she'd seen him in person a few times, just for coffee, she claimed. And yeah, maybe if I were naive, I'd believe that. But something inside me knew this was just her testing how much I'd tolerate. I asked her bluntly, did anything physical happen? She paused, just a second too long, then nodded, barely looking at me, mumbling, it just kind of happened, as if that explanation was supposed to make things better. I sat there, feeling like the ground had vanished beneath me. She actually admitted it, almost casually, as if it just happened and wasn't a deliberate choice. The worst part was her attempt to downplay it, saying it was just a one-time thing, as if that should somehow ease my pain. But it only made things worse. Here I was, pouring all my energy into trying to salvage something, trying to find a shred of honesty in this mess, and she'd gone behind my back, not just emotionally, but physically too. I asked her, why? Why would you do this when we were supposed to be planning our future together? Her answer. She said she'd been confused, felt like she'd lost a part of herself, and somehow reconnecting with Matt helped her feel whole again. She continued, saying she never intended to hurt me and didn't think it would go this far. Hearing that made me feel like an absolute fool. All those signs I'd brushed off, every vague answer she gave when I'd asked about him, they all clicked into place. I trusted her, and she'd taken advantage of that. While I'd been planning our life together, she'd been stepping out with someone else, letting him into parts of her life that should have been ours. I tried to keep my composure, but I felt myself getting angrier. I told her I thought we were in this together, that we were building something real. She looked down, clearly feeling guilty, but at that point, her guilt meant nothing to me. She was only sorry because she'd been caught. If I hadn't seen those messages, she would have kept everything hidden, masking it behind fake smiles and empty eye. Love yous, I asked. Do you even care about us anymore? Or was this just a game to you? She had no real answer. Just kept saying she was confused and made a mistake, but this wasn't a mistake. A mistake is forgetting to buy milk on the way home. This was a choice she made, fully aware of what it would do to us. Eventually, I couldn't stand to hear any more excuses. I told her that if she wanted to be with him, then maybe she should go. I wasn't going to sit around while she figured out if I was worth it. She kept saying she wanted to make things right, that she'd do whatever it took to make it up to me. But honestly, I was done. I couldn't believe a single word she was saying. I got up and started packing a bag, telling her I needed space to clear my head. This time she didn't try to stop me, she just stood there, looking defeated as I gathered my things. I could see her watching me, like she wanted to say something but didn't know how. But at that point, I didn't want to hear it. As I was heading out, she called after me, saying, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't even look back." Her apologies meant nothing now. I was done with all the lies, the secrecy, and the half-hearted excuses. I felt betrayed on a level I hadn't thought possible. I got in my car and just sat there, processing everything. Her words echoed in my head, replaying over and over, and I kept wondering how I hadn't seen this coming. All the red flags were there, but I'd ignored them because I wanted to believe in us. I wanted to think we had something real, something worth fighting for. Driving away that night, I felt more alone than ever. This was the person I'd built my life around, the one I thought I'd be with forever. Now, it felt like all those years and memories had shattered in an instant. This is where things started to get real. After I left the apartment, I spent a few more days at my parents' place, trying to clear my head. I still couldn't believe she'd crossed the line with him, not just emotionally, but physically too. Everything we'd been building over the years felt like it was collapsing, and I was left with all these questions about what had been true and what had been a lie. But then, something else hit me, adding to the mess. I started thinking about all the ways she'd been depending on me financially over the years. Yeah, she worked part-time and chipped in occasionally, but it was plain as day that I'd been the one ensuring our lives were comfortable. I helped her get a dependable car, one that was technically in my name. I co-signed our apartment lease because her credit wasn't great, and I covered most of our expenses from day one. In a way, it felt like she'd been relying on me as a safety net while secretly carrying on this other side of her life. To make things worse, I started realizing just how much she depended on me. She didn't have strong family support, and most of her friends were either our mutual friends or people who drifted away over time. I was her main support, the one she leaned on for everything, and here she was betraying me with some guy who probably couldn't even offer her half of what I did. When I decided to go back to the apartment to pick up more of my stuff, she was there. Right away, I could tell she'd been waiting for me. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept much, and for a brief moment I thought, good, maybe now she understands what she's lost, but I quickly pushed that thought aside. I wasn't about to feel sorry for her. She'd done this to herself. As soon as I walked in, she jumped into apology mode, saying she'd thought a lot about everything and would do whatever it took to make things right. She was saying all the right words, but I'd heard it all before, and now those words meant nothing. She kept talking about how much she'd missed me the past few days, how she couldn't believe she'd let things go this far. She insisted she'd cut him off and wanted us to try counseling to work through this together. But all I could think about was her behavior before, all the time she'd acted like everything was fine while lying to my face. It was hard to believe she'd changed just because she'd been caught. I told her I didn't believe her promises anymore, and that if she'd wanted to work on things, she should have thought about that before sneaking around. She kept looking at me with pleading eyes, but I wasn't going to fall for it. I told her I was the one who'd put everything into this relationship: time, money, commitment, while she'd been off keeping secrets. She tried to argue that she'd contributed too, but let's be honest, most of what she had was because of me. I'd been paying for nearly everything, covering her when she couldn't afford it, and making sure she had what she needed. Realizing that I'd been supporting her all this time only for her to throw it all away for some guy who likely didn't care about her half as much as I did, made my blood boil. Then she said something that made me furious. She claimed I just got caught up in the excitement of reconnecting with an old friend. I never thought it would go this far. I couldn't believe she was still calling him an old friend after all that had happened. I asked her, how can you justify doing this to the person who's been there for you, who's been taking care of you all this time? She didn't have a good answer. Just looked away, her face turning red in embarrassment, but I didn't care. By then, I'd had enough. I told her I was done, that I couldn't stay with someone who'd put me through this. She got emotional, started crying, saying things like, I know I messed up, but I can't imagine my life without you. She even tried to hug me, but I stepped back. I wasn't going to comfort her when she'd done nothing to earn it. She then started talking about how difficult things would be for her without me, that she didn't know where she'd go or what she'd do. It felt like she was trying to guilt trip me into staying, hoping I'd feel sorry for her and give her another chance. But all I could think about was how easy it had been for her to betray me after everything I'd done. If she'd truly cared about us, about me, she would have respected our relationship enough to shut down that old friend nonsense from the start. I told her, you've been leaning on me all this time, but it's clear you didn't value what we had. You're just now realizing it because you're about to lose everything that made your life comfortable. And that was the truth. I'd been her support, her rock, the one who made her life stable, and she tossed all of that away for the thrill of reconnecting with a guy who probably wouldn't even commit to her. She kept saying she was sorry, that she'd learned her lesson, and that she'd prove herself if I just gave her a chance. But I couldn't trust her anymore. I told her I'd be removing my name from the lease, and that she'd need to figure out her own place to stay. She panicked, trying to argue, saying she couldn't afford the apartment on her own and didn't have anywhere else to go. And yeah, maybe that sounds harsh, but at this point, I didn't care. I wasn't responsible for her anymore. The more she talked, the more desperate she sounded, going on about how much she needed me, how lost she'd be without me. That's when it hit me she wasn't fighting for me, she was fighting to keep her comfortable life, the one I built for her. This was never about us or love, it was about what I provided, what she was scared of losing after burning the bridge. By the end of it, I felt like a weight had been lifted. I wasn't responsible for her mess, and I wasn't going to let her make me feel like I was. I grabbed the rest of my things, and as I walked out the door, she was still calling after me, saying she'd change and prove herself. But I was done with empty promises that meant nothing. Driving away, I felt an odd sense of relief. Yeah, it hurt, and the betrayal cut deep in a way I hadn't known before, but at least now I knew the truth. At least now I could finally move forward without constantly wondering if she was hiding something or lying to my face. And that's where I left things with her standing there, realizing she'd lost everything because of her own actions. I wasn't going to keep being her safety net. She'd made her choices, and now she had to live with them. Here's how it all ended after I left her there in the apartment. I thought that was it. I was ready to cut my losses, move on, and start fresh. I packed up my things, told her I was done, and considered that chapter of my life closed. I didn't expect to hear from her again, especially after everything I'd said. But of course, she couldn't just let it go that easily. A few days later, she started texting me. At first, I ignored it. I didn't see the point in dragging things out. I was done. I didn't want to hear more explanations or excuses. But the messages kept coming, long, drawn-out paragraphs about how much she missed me, how she'd made a huge mistake, and how she'd do anything to make things right. Reading them just reminded me of how far she'd let things go and how much damage had already been done. She must have realized I wasn't going to respond to her texts, so she started trying to call. I ignored her attempts to reach out. I'd already invested too much time and energy in her drama, and I wasn't about to get drawn back in just because she had regrets. But she didn't let up, trying to reach me every day for a week. Finally, she left a voicemail, saying she was outside my parents' place and just needed to talk. It felt like she was forcing my hand, and I realized if I didn't address it, she'd keep popping up wherever I went. So I went outside to talk to her, and she looked rough like she hadn't slept or eaten in days. She started with the same routine I'd already seen in her texts and calls, saying she knew she'd messed up, that she'd take full responsibility, and that she'd do anything to prove herself to me. But I wasn't interested in hearing her performance. I told her she'd already shown who she was through her actions, and nothing she said now would change that. Then she said, "I have nowhere else to go," and for a second, I felt guilt creeping in, but I shut it down. I wasn't the one who betrayed trust, who'd been sneaking around and lying for who knows how long. Those were her choices, not mine. I told her, "You should have thought about that before you did what you did." She started to cry, saying she didn't mean for things to turn out this way, and that she hadn't realized how much she needed me until now. But all I saw was someone scared of facing the consequences of her own actions. She wasn't sorry for betraying me, she was sorry she got caught and had to face the fallout. And that wasn't my problem. She kept pleading, saying she needed my support and couldn't handle all of this alone, then asked if she could stay with me just until she figured things out. I could tell she thought I'd cave, that I'd give in because of our history and the fact that I'd been her support for so long. But I told her, "No, you're on your own now. You wanted to keep secrets, so go and figure out your life without me." She kept begging, saying she couldn't make it alone, that she didn't have the resources or stability. It felt like she was using every excuse she could think of to make me feel bad enough to take her back. But I wasn't going to be manipulated. I looked her in the eye and told her, "You're only here because you realized how good you had it. If you really cared about me, you wouldn't have done any of this in the first place." At that point, she seemed to understand I wasn't changing my mind. She started crying harder, talking about how she had no idea what to do and that she'd made a mistake. But honestly, I was done feeling sorry. She'd made her bed, and now it was her time to lie in it. I didn't owe her anything, not a place to stay, not my sympathy, nothing. Before she left, she made one last attempt to tell me she'd do anything to make things right. But I wasn't interested. I told her that if she wanted to change, she should start by being honest with herself about who she is and why she does what she does. All her talk about not meaning for it to happen was just her way of avoiding responsibility. She'd made her choices, and now she had to live with them. As I watched her walk away, I felt a wave of relief. Sure, there was still some pain. Losing someone you thought you'd spend your life with isn't easy, no matter the circumstances. But letting go of that weight of being her safety net and the one who always took care of her felt like lifting a burden off my shoulders. I'd carried that relationship for so long, and it was time to let it go. A few days later, she sent one final text, a long message trying to clear the air and asking if we could still be friends. That one made me laugh. Friends? After everything? I didn't even reply, I just deleted it and blocked her number. I wasn't going to let her keep a foot in the door, hoping she could crawl back whenever things got tough. Looking back now, I see how much I'd been ignoring all the red flags. She'd always been somewhat dependent on me financially and emotionally, and I chalked it up to her needing a little extra support. But it's clear now that she was more interested in what I could provide than actually building a future together. It wasn't love, it was convenience. To everyone who warned me she wasn't marriage material, that I was setting myself up for heartbreak, thank you. You were right. I was blinded by what I thought we had, by the future I believed we were creating. But in the end, I dodged a bullet, and for that, I'm grateful. I can move on, knowing I didn't settle for someone who didn't deserve me. This whole experience taught me to trust my instincts, notice red flags, and know when to walk away. She can figure out her own path now, just like I'm figuring out mine. Maybe one day she'll learn something from all of this, but honestly, that's no longer my concern. I have my own life to live, and I'm finally free to live it without constantly worrying if I'm being lied to. So, yeah, that's how it ended. She had nowhere to go, no plan, and no one else to turn to because she burned her bridges. And me. I'm done looking back. I'm ready to move forward and find someone who values me for real. Here's how things played out after I cut her off for good. A couple of weeks went by, and honestly, I finally started to feel like I could breathe again. The constant stress was gone, and for the first time in months, I was able to focus on myself, work, and moving forward. I hadn't heard from her since I blocked her, and that was fine by me. I was putting it all behind me, or at least trying to. Then one day, I was hanging out with a friend, his wife's close friends, with a girl who knew my ex pretty well, so they'd ended up hearing some things. My friend looked hesitant at first, But eventually he said, "Man, you're going to want to hear this," from the look on his face. I could tell it wasn't good, but at that point, I was curious. Turns out, right after we split, my ex went straight to Matt, the same guy she cheated with. They spent a week or two together, and for a second, I'll admit, I felt a sting. I mean, yeah, I was over her, but hearing she jumped into something with the same guy she'd thrown everything away for still hit. But that feeling didn't last long, because here's the kicker: Matt wasn't in it for the long haul. Apparently he hooked up with her for a bit, but after about 2 weeks, he went right back to his own girlfriend, just left my ex hanging like she meant nothing more than a quick fling. She thought she was running off to something exciting, only to get dumped and left alone just like that. I'll be honest, hearing about this was oddly satisfying. Not because I wanted her to be miserable, but because it felt like karma. She threw away a 3-year relationship, lied to my face, and tried to get me back only after realizing what she was losing. And in the end, she got tossed aside by the very guy she thought was worth risking everything for. It's wild to think about how fast it all came full circle. She lost everything she had with me for a fling that didn't even last 2 weeks, and now she's got nothing, no relationship, no stability, and nobody to rely on. She made her choices, and finally they caught up with her.